Without further ado, Danny and myself from the Academy of Fab Stuff are thrilled to introduce our speaker this lunchtime, Kenny Gibson. Kenny is a power of nature, a superpower of nature, a man who has limitless positivity and focus to make a difference, and as you can see, loves yellow. Now, I'm just going to leave it there and say, Kenny, thank you so much for joining us on your holiday to deliver this session for us. And over to you, Kenny.
Thank you so much for the invite. Fabulous week, fabulous events, and a fabulous opportunity to connect with colleagues and to talk about issues regarding trauma in our organisations, etc. So the first thing is, hello, my name is Kenny Gibson. I'm the National Head of Safeguarding for the NHS. So I'm your Head of Safeguarding. Whether you're a clinician, a carer, work with people in the community in primary care, across the NHS or independent healthcare providers, I'm your National Head of Safeguarding. And that's really important for me to say, because some of what we will talk about today is about trauma in our organisations. Some of what we talk about is trauma caused by our organisations. But what we'll also talk about is the so what and what next of trauma across our organisations. And so the first thing I need to say is welfare alert. If at any time you find some of what I'm talking about triggering, or it's just a little bit too much to listen to, then please just disconnect from the session. It's being recorded. Disconnect from the session and just find your own safe space. And again, I'll be talking about that later. We'll also have about 15-20 minutes for conversation, but do use the chat. If there is something during the slides that you think, what did that mean, or that's not quite my understanding, then post it in the chat and I'll build it in to my presentation with you over the next half an hour. As well as safeguarding, my background is in public health nursing. I'm a mental health nurse. I'm also a midwife by trade as well. And I'll be bringing in some of the stuff that I've had to listen to, bear witness to, and discuss. So let me share my slides. For those that use Teams, you'll be familiar with this 10-second delay. So during the 10-second delay, one of the things I'll say is, for the people on the meeting, this is about us. This is about us as people, because it would be remiss of me to talk about trauma, being trauma-informed organisationally, if we can't talk about us. So the first slide we're going to discuss is the reaction that you and I have in adversity. And whether we're talking about the last 3 years of COVID, or indeed the last year of cash crisis, poverty crisis, fuel poverty, everything in our community not feeling in control, then for each one of us, we will be in a moment of adversity. We were certainly in adversity during COVID. Some of us were redeployed to areas that we didn't know anything about. Some of us were redeployed to areas we knew a little bit about, but wasn't within our comfort zone. And some of us stayed where we were. But I don't think there is anyone on this call, indeed there is no one across the span of healthcare, and there's certainly no registered clinician or unpaid carer or carer that did not feel the adversity and a slip of their resilience. And that is really important to appreciate, because if we as registrants, as nurses, as professional practitioners, as carers, indeed as citizens, if our resilience declines to such a point that we feel in survival mode, then that is when trauma can take hold. That is particularly when exploiters, such as scammers, exploiters such as domestic violence perpetrators, or even work bullies can take hold and impact us. Now, if you look at this slide, which is part of mental health and public health considerations, also in survival mode, we've got destructive behaviours. We self-sabotage ourselves, our confidence plummets, we get over-worried, etc. And our physical and emotional strength saps from us, it drains from us. And I can bet the vast majority of us have been there in the last 3 years. Certainly, I've been there. There was one Friday in the first 6 months of COVID, I'd done 2 vaccination clinics in very, very quickly. And I was sitting one Friday afternoon, late afternoon, doing some work, and I got a call. And the call took about an hour. It was from the tax office of I'd not declared tax to the tune of £1,387. And I was just about to pay them when my husband came upstairs and suddenly stopped me. It was a scam. But I was so exhausted, so much in survival mode, that I got caught up in a scam on the phone. So whether you're the National Head of Safeguarding that should know what they're doing, whether you're an unpaid carer, as I am as well now, or whether you're a registrant, we can all be in that adversity situation. However, there is also the upward arrow here, where, as we're going to discover, if we can be adaptive with each other, if we can be more accepting of change, if we can start reframing our conversation, we can get to some degree of recovery. And it is absolutely critical that if you or a colleague or a member of your staff or indeed a neighbour is in adversity and has a trauma reaction, then it is important to recognise recovery. And by working with reality, no longer avoiding change, having increased empathy, but curiosity as well, then we can grow, we can flourish. And this is the stage that in every pandemic we find ourselves in, that organisational recovery after the 2.5 years of COVID. And the organisational self-belief, your self-awareness, being more mindful is really important for growth. But let's revisit some of the trauma-informed ingredients that happened in your organisation and my organisation in order for us to be recovered from 2.5 years of pandemic in COVID. And this is particularly the case when some of us were redeployed into areas that we were not familiar with, was outside our scope of practice. If you recall, even the system leaders were talking about the front line, a war footing, making ready for the next wave or next tsunami of COVID. The whole language of COVID changed our understanding of being trauma-informed in our care and trauma-informed in our culture. And that has had a remarkable adverse effect on us as colleagues, on us as clinicians, particularly over on the right-hand side, secondary trauma. As we as clinicians, whether we were in the front line of intensive care units, or whether we were frontline visiting someone's home that was on shielding and lockdown, or whether we were on the front line of primary care as a practice nurse, trying to keep a handle on all our chronically ill patients and families, or indeed whether we were in lockdown, working from home 24 hours a day. Secondary trauma is extremely important to understand. Because as clinicians, as carers, as colleagues, as community citizens, what we do in our caring role is we listen. We listen to someone's diagnostics. We listen to someone's journey. And yes, during COVID, we listened, but more importantly, we absolutely bore witness to other people's trauma. That secondary trauma, that vicarious trauma issue is so critical. I recall towards the end of the first year of COVID, my husband suddenly went paraplegic. He had undiagnosed advanced prostate cancer, and he ended up having a T6 spinal cancer, which has left him paralysed from T6 down, the diaphragm down. He is paraplegic. And I remember him being in hospital with me, unable to visit him, until I explained to the sister in the intensive care unit that it was one thing for my husband to be in intensive care, but the secondary trauma of being parted from his husband, who was well versed in ITU techniques, might make his recovery slower. And that sister listened to me. She listened to my knowledge, my understanding of secondary trauma, and she invited me in. Yes, I had to use all the double gowns and whatever the PPE, protective equipment we are given. And I applaud that ward manager. The medics weren't so welcoming, and certainly the directors and chief executive levels weren't so welcoming. However, we were able to work through to avoid my husband the secondary trauma of being separated. When my husband, after 12 days of intensive care unit, went to reablement unit, it was a very different story of secondary trauma. I was refused access to the centre itself until I issued them an Article 8 complaint that they were stopping me seeing my family, my husband, and that would in fact re-trigger trauma for him and diminish his recovery. So there are moments, even during COVID, when we as clinicians need to begin looking at secondary trauma and finding a way of preventing it, of limiting it. And one of the things we can do is make sure that patients see loved ones, that patients keep contact with families, because that keeps a degree of normalization. It keeps a degree of humanity in that person's environment. Yes, we've got communication. Yes, we've got engaging patients and all the planning, all the things you see there. But if there is one thing that really does stop trauma happening at the point of care, it is making sure we understand what would be traumatic for that individual patient. And that is exactly what we do in our own situation of ingredients for trauma. Our trauma can be impacted by something called moral distress and moral injury. Indeed, there is some excellent research published on this. You will not have heard of moral distress and moral injury before COVID. But COVID and the COVID lockdown has changed forever our conversations. We are absolutely more emotionally intelligent. For instance, in COVID for my job, there were 6 midwives in Birmingham suddenly began talking about the increased number of Muslim pregnant women that were disclosing domestic abuse at home, intergenerational domestic abuse, and coercive and controlling behaviours. And I decided to avoid anything about not believing those practitioners. I decided to begin launching a phrase of believing in called local practitioner intelligence. Those midwives weren't coming to me as a National Head of Safeguarding with anecdote. They were coming to me with an authentic truth of local practitioner intelligence on 6 women. Within a fortnight, in Birmingham and across the Midlands, we'd convened a curiosity group, a listening lounge. And we had listened to 60 midwives, all finding the same local practitioner intelligence. And you know something? It lifted their moral passion to make things work. Because up until then, they had been dismissed, they had been told that their feedback didn't matter, didn't count. And that set them on the path of moral distress, that they were unable to act ethically. They felt powerless to find a turn of phrase or a few words to convert anecdote into something more meaningful. And so every clinician has got to be able to turn colleagues' distress or moral injury, the psychological social trauma that happens when what we know to be correct and true and authentic isn't played out by our organisation. We need to meet together. We need to support each other. And we need to challenge a culture of silence in order to reframe the language, to be more affirming, to be more authentic. So this moral distress happens in us all. It is more than likely that one or more of us on this call has joined the call because in COVID we felt moral distress and moral injury in what we saw, what we heard, what we were seeing, etc. Because some of that, if not most of it, had never been seen before, had never been felt before. And so in our COVID recovery period, we need to begin bearing witness to the moral distress and moral injury that colleagues have felt. And in that moral injury, we must understand how important it is that it is cyclical and it is staged. Now, this doesn't relate specifically to nursing or healthcare, because you know something, moral injury in the care sector does include policing, it does include education, it does include housing, it includes all the welfare organisations. And as we regroup around our recovery, it will be critically important for nurses and midwives, clinicians and practitioners to go into their system of safeguarding or trauma-informed and have conversations with community safety partnerships, have conversation with education, teachers and classroom assistants, have conversations with housing officers, have conversations with voluntary sector and say, how did COVID impact us? How did it impact us because of our own poverty, our own demographic, indeed our own ethnicity? And we need to begin talking about those feelings, sometimes of shame, sometimes of guilt by not being at a front line. If we were shielding, the frustration and some of it self-harm. I work in an organisation of less than 6,000 people. And in the last 2 months, I have personally dealt with 7 people who are self-harming as a result of their own moral injury or their own trauma not having been dealt with through COVID. And so we need to begin looking at this moral injury cycle together. What stage are we? How do we avoid going to the next stage of moral injury? How do we talk about our feelings, etc.? And that's really important and will only happen if we lead on establishing 2 things. One of them is the big blue box, the psychological safety. A lot has been written on psychological safety, about job satisfaction, about what we're experiencing mentally or viscerally, about the relief that we need to feel, and that how our senses, our touch, our vision, our hearing, the 5 senses experiencing. It's all about noticing. But colleagues, you cannot notice if you're not curious. You cannot be curious if you're not prepared to ask really challenging questions. And those questions are fundamentally important to us. In the second part of COVID, towards the second year, domestic abuse numbers rose. They quadrupled in some areas. Interestingly, 6 months after alcohol online sales trebled. So as alcohol on sales trebled, so domestic abuse and violence quadrupled. Interesting, isn't it? And so it led me to be professionally curious about domestic abuse. Now, I've never been coercively controlled. I'm lucky I've never had a violent partner, nor have I felt the need to be violent. But I also have felt frustration with my husband in lockdown. You know, it may sound funny, but one day I remember it being a Saturday, and I was sitting doing some Zen embroidery, because my mindfulness is Zen embroidery. That's how I discharge from work and begin being Kenny the husband. And he was washing the dishes. Yes, I don't have a dishwasher. I love washing dishes. It's another hobby. It's another mindfulness. As ironing is, I know I'm a strange lad, but washing dishes, ironing and Zen embroidery is what gets me into the Kenny zone. However, I was just noticing him. Now, we've lived together 35 years, and he still doesn't rinse the soap off the dishes. Now, in any other day, I would have laughed it off. But on this day, after 15 months of lockdown with him, it was just, if he doesn't wash the dish, if he doesn't rinse the dishes, you know, that tension in me was overbearing. And it wasn't until I went to work and created a psychological safe space for me to share that with people. It is absolutely critical we create psychological safety at work, because there will be experiences at work that really frustrate us. There will be experiences, indeed, there may be managers and leaders and colleagues at work that really annoy us. And we need to vent that annoyance and frustration somewhere. Some people have called it restorative supervision. Some people have called it resilience-based supervision. But it is a space and a place where Kenny the husband, Kenny the National Head of Safeguarding, Kenny the vaccination person, Kenny, the public health practitioner, can go and just say, this situation makes me feel in a certain way. Let it go and come back in my behaviour. So psychological safety is critical. The other one that's really essential for us as organisations, if we are going to really look at moral injury and being trauma informed, is something that the Army use and the World Health Organization use, and those are after action reviews. You can see 4 questions that are posed during an after action review. The NHS safeguarding team that I have the humbling privilege to work in uses after action review every 6 months. And so we look at what was supposed to happen, but what actually happened. So we note down the facts. What have we learnt from this so that we can create a shared narrative? But the most important section is the green section. Why was there a difference between what was supposed to happen and what actually happened and our learning? We can reflect on incidents galore. Indeed, many a national independent inquiry is reporting. But it is critical that that report, as well as the humbling recommendations that independent inquiries bring and national reports bring, what that report must do is look towards the future. So what can we learn from this? And let's move on with that. And so these after action reviews, whether they're done in teams or directorates, etc., are really important when we've had such a massive 2.5 years of COVID. Sometimes they're facilitated and sometimes not. So what can we do together as colleagues before we begin having a dialogue? For me, anything reported to moral injury or reflected or being trauma informed requires us to listen. It then requires us to believe what we're hearing and bear witness to that by doing something. Not dismissing it as anecdote, but giving it a reframe of local practitioner intelligence. And as I've begun recovering in the system by being out and about, by being able to listen and sit down and have a cup of tea with colleagues again, and feel their visceral sense of trauma, there are just a few things I think I would like to leave us with before we open up for conversation. There is no substitute in being trauma informed by being authentic. We just need to look at the politics of today to realise authenticity counts for a lot. Be authentic. Reach out and be present with people. They don't always want boxes of chocolates left at the door. They don't always want big bunches of flowers. What we want is someone to sit down with us, have a cup of tea, and understand what I need to say. It's about listening and bearing witness. So presence, not presence, is really important when it comes to being trauma informed. The other thing that's important about trauma is there is a lot of incidents about trauma. There's an awful lot of stuff surfacing, and it's not necessarily in the NHS. It's not even necessarily in healthcare. Across our communities, in our homes, dare I say. there are serious incidents, and it's incumbent on us to reflect on those. We've got things like Black Lives Matter, violence against women and girls, the Me Too campaign, that have reflected on serious incidents impacting our society. And yet, like Fabulous Academy, they've learned from excellence. Because the vast majority of what we do as clinicians, as carers, as citizens, and as fabulous people, we support each other to be the best we can be, the best Kenny I can be. So learning from excellence is just as important as reflecting on incidents. We must also celebrate. You know, yes, there are some errors, and we apologise profoundly for some of the errors that the system has made. However, we must celebrate that the small things are the big wins in our lives. You know, our families. It's a bit like if you've got kinship, or you're looking after children, or you're a parent. The small things are the big wins. And that is exactly the same in trauma. We must create listening lounges. And I don't mean trite listening lounges where you can go and everyone has a nice cup of tea. I mean areas where Kenny can be a husband because it impacts his work, or Kenny can be a nurse because it impacts his job as a national head of safeguarding, or Kenny can be working at a vaccination clinic because it impacts his role as a public health nurse, or Kenny can challenge an august organisation that you will let me see my husband because otherwise you're in breach of Article 8 of the Human Rights. So we must create these listening lounges, but more importantly, out of them, we must bear witness to what we've heard. So we must safely signpost to people. We must co-create social movements. And when we can, if it's possible, we must also bring hope. Because colleagues and fabulous peers, that is what trauma-informed means. There we go. Because colleagues, it is about the ability to come together, to listen together, to believe together. Together we're stronger. Together we can change things. And that safe signposting is really important. I'm going to stop there, Terry, and have a read of the chat if anyone wants to do. Shall we stop the recording and